Hello everyone, I'm bringing you another recommended reading video today, and what we're having a look at here is The Navy in the News and More Navy in the News. Now these are two books, readily available, very cheap. The reason I recommend them is they're a sort of compilation of various stories, photographs, some of the cartoons from Navy News, which is the Royal Navy's newspaper. Now these books cover from 1954 through until the early 1990s, so the Cold War era, which is obviously interesting from my point of view specifically. And as I say, they're worth getting. They can be had for about £2.50 each, something like that, second hand. And they're full of very interesting photographs and extracts from stories. Navy News is not as easy to find as Soldier magazine. It's produced very much as a newspaper as opposed to a magazine in the style of Soldier magazine, and I think was viewed as being a bit more disposable from that point of view. I do have a few original copies, which I may include in the video, from I think the late 70s is the earliest I have, and I have a couple from the early 80s, Falklands War era, and then from the early 90s, so the Gulf War era. Interested to find more if I can, but they aren't as easy to find as Soldier magazine. Certainly the earlier ones, I've not seen 60s or 50s editions of Navy News for sale anywhere, so I'm keeping an eye out for those. But these two books cover some of the stories, and from that point of view are quite interesting, and that's what we're going to have a quick flick through now. So here we have The Navy in the News, 1954 to 1991, and More Navy in the News, 1954 to 1994. So this one obviously goes a little bit further than this one in terms of dates covered, but just further stories, further articles, photographs and so forth. Navy News, as I say, was produced as more of a newspaper. I have some original copies here that sort of span the date range of the copies I have. We have one from the 1970s here, 1976, which is the earliest example I have. We have one here from June 1982, dealing with the Falklands War, of course. You can see there, Guns at Dawn as the headline there. And then we have one from October 1990, and the Navy in the Gulf there, of course. You can see that there. Navy News is a lot more difficult to come across than, say, Soldier magazine, as mentioned. I think partly because it is very much a newspaper, it was seen as more disposable and people are less likely to hang on to them. So I am always on the lookout for more copies of Navy News. It would be great to find some earlier ones, but I say we have one from the 1970s there, which is interesting in and of itself. So those are some original copies there, just to give you an idea of what Navy News was about. These books cover some of the stories that were covered in Navy News over the years. You can see here we have some full page spreads, so this is done in chronological order. So you have stories and we have information on the paper itself. You have details here from the 1950s, some photographs and some stories replicated here. Obviously, nice front cover there dealing with Polaris, the Polaris TEF Perfect, moving into the 1960s, and obviously the introduction of nuclear-powered submarines into the Royal Navy. And there's quite a lot of information on that. Some of the cartoons are reproduced in here as well, and some of them are quite amusing. The various topics covered in these, have another, just flick past it, have another front page there, replicated for the 1970s. I rather like this photograph here of a chap in full Arctic kit outside Horse Guards. It's rather good, that. And we carry on through, flicking through, just to give you an idea of the sort of things that are covered in here. Some really excellent photographs, nicely reproduced, and a good way of getting hold of this information in these photographs, which are otherwise hard to get hold of because they were published in Navy News, and Navy News is difficult to find. So it's very nice to see these various photographs reproduced. Hydrofoil under test there, interesting, and all sorts of stories with more information here, more cartoons replicated here, as you can see, details of the Falklands War, some good photographs that have appeared elsewhere, of course. Many of the photographs you see of the Falklands War were reproduced elsewhere, but nevertheless this is another nice adjunct to that, and featured heavily in the newspaper at the time, and obviously features heavily in here. And then moving through into the 1990s, of course. So some interesting information and details in there. And as I say, that's the first of the two books. This one just has further of the same in it. So we flick to the start here. You again have the 1950s, starting in the 1950s. And this was produced in 1994. So it's 40 years on from when Navy News was first produced in 1954. So you have information there, photographs from the 1950s, stories and so forth reproduced from the 1950s. And then flicking through again into the 1960s and on through. Obviously we have here the first British-built, British-powered nuclear submarine in the British fleet, 1966 there. And just lots of further information, again, more of the cartoons reproduced as well. And the photographs are really quite interesting, and there's a lot of detail in them, and as I say, it's nice that they've been reproduced in these books, because otherwise they'd be difficult to get hold of. So, not giving sort of an exhaustive flick through these, obviously, but just to give you an idea of the sort of information, the photographs and so forth, which are included within. It's another photograph I rather like. Always interesting to see sailors on horseback. So, as I say, it's quite, given the price, given how cheap they are, which is something I'll probably mention many times in this video, they're well worth getting. And if you're interested in the naval history for Cold War, definitely worth having both of these. So that's just a quick flick through these. As I said, not a huge in-depth look at these, but a flick through, show you what's there. They may well be of interest, and as I say, they can be purchased very cheaply second-hand online, and from that perspective, very much worth having. So I do hope you found it interesting looking at this. As I say, if you do have an interest in Royal Navy's Cold War era history, these two books are well worth picking up. They're exceedingly cheap and obviously full of interesting photographs, so there's no reason not to pick up copies of these. They're available secondhand, readily available online, and I highly recommend picking them up from that point of view. They're very good value for money, I think I would say, given how cheap they are secondhand. So well worth having a look out for these. Again, with Navy News being relatively hard to find, original copies from certainly the earlier period. I think 90s copies are relatively easy to find, and some 80s copies, but going back further it becomes a lot more difficult. It's well worth getting these books because they obviously cover some of that ground that's a little bit difficult to actually find the original editions for. So definitely worth it from my perspective, and you hopefully found this interesting, and it may have informed your decision to buy these or not, if it's sort of an area of history that interests you. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as I always say, a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.